My teacher refused to let anyone leave her class for any reason, until my friend collapsed on the floor while she did nothing. I broke the rules to save his life, and she made it her mission to destroy me for it. It started on a Tuesday in October, the kind of gray morning that makes you want to crawl back into bed. Mrs. Henderson walked into AP Biology with her usual flat smile. She announced that absolutely no one was allowed to leave the classroom for any reason until the bell rang in 53 minutes. Her voice had this sharp edge that made everyone sit up straighter. I don't care if you're sick, dizzy, or having a panic attack, she said, setting her mug down with a hard clink. You stay in your seats, no exceptions. The whole class exchanged looks. Even for Henderson, this was extreme. She'd always been strict, but this felt different, more personal somehow, like she was trying to prove a point we didn't understand yet. I should mention that Mrs. Henderson and I had history. Last month, she'd made a mistake during a lecture about DNA replication, mixing up the leading and lagging strands. I'd politely raised my hand and corrected her, explaining the difference in front of the whole class. The entire room had turned to look at me, then back at her. You could have heard a pin drop. She'd stood there for 10 seconds, her face turning red like a ripe tomato. Then she'd quietly erased the board and written the correct information. But I could feel her eyes on me for the rest of the semester. Cold, calculating stares that made my skin crawl. She'd started calling on me more often, asking harder questions, grading my papers more harshly. Nothing I could prove, but the pattern was clear. Today we're covering cellular respiration, she announced, turning to write on the whiteboard. And since apparently some of you think you know more than your teacher, we'll be having a pop quiz at the end of class. Great! Another way to make everyone hate me. I could already feel the annoyed glances from my classmates. Thanks, Mrs. Henderson. 20 minutes into her lecture about the Krebs cycle, I noticed Marcus Chen starting to sway in his seat. I was sitting 2 rows behind him, close enough to see the sweat beading on his neck despite the classroom's chilly air conditioning. His breathing got shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing you see in people who are about to pass out. I'd seen it before when my diabetic cousin had low glucose episodes during family dinners. Marcus was the type of kid who never caused trouble. Honor roll student since freshman year, never missed school unless he was literally hospitalized, always had his homework done 3 days early. If Marcus looked sick, he was really sick. He raised his hand weakly. Mrs. Henderson, I don't feel good. She didn't even look at him. Put your hand down, Marcus. We're not falling for that old trick today. But I really don't. I said put your hand down. Marcus's hand dropped to his desk. His face was getting pale, almost gray. The girl next to him, Laura Martinez, kept looking between Marcus and Mrs. Henderson with growing alarm. I could see other students starting to notice something was wrong. Tommy Williams, who sat in front of Marcus, turned around with concern. Even Jake Peterson, who usually slept through biology, was sitting up and staring. Marcus tried to steady himself by gripping his desk, but his hands were shaking. A few beads of sweat dripped onto his notebook, smearing the ink from his notes. Then he just collapsed. His chair scraped against the floor as he pitched forward, slumping over his desk before sliding down to the ground. The sound echoed through the silent classroom like a gunshot. Everyone froze for a heartbeat, staring at Marcus lying on the floor. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the hum of the fluorescent lights, someone's sharp intake of breath. Everyone froze except me. My body moved before my brain caught up. I jumped out of my seat and rushed over to Marcus, dropping to my knees beside him. He was completely unresponsive, his breathing shallow and irregular. Someone call 911, I shouted, checking his pulse at his neck like I'd learned in the CPR class I'd taken last summer. His heartbeat was rapid but weak. Now! Laura Martinez was already reaching for her phone, but Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a whip. Nobody moves, nobody calls anyone. But Mrs. Henderson stepped between me and the door, her arms crossed like a bouncer at a nightclub. Her coffee mug sat forgotten on her desk, steam still rising from it. Sit down, Caroline. Now. Her voice was ice cold, the same tone she used when she was about to hand out detentions for talking. He's unconscious and needs help. We need to get the nurse. I tried to move around her, but she sidestepped to block me again. Her coffee breath was hot on my face. I said sit down. He's fine. Students fake medical emergencies all the time to get out of tests. She glanced at Marcus dismissively, especially right before pop quizzes. I stared at her in disbelief. Marcus was lying on the floor and she thought it was fake? Look at him, I said, gesturing frantically. Does this look fake to you? Laura Martinez had knelt beside Marcus, trying to check his pulse with shaking hands. He's barely breathing, she said, her voice cracking. This isn't fake, Mrs. Henderson. Something's really wrong. Tommy Williams stood up from his seat. Mrs. Henderson, he looks really pale. Maybe we should sit down, Tommy. Everyone sit down right now. But more students were getting up now. Jake Peterson was standing by his desk looking scared. Emily Rodriguez had her phone out, ready to dial 911. Put that phone away, Emily, now. But Henderson just crossed her arms tighter. Everyone back to your seats. Marcus will be fine in a few minutes when he realizes his little performance isn't working. That's when I noticed Marcus's lips were turning pale. My cousin's lips had done the same thing during her worst hypoglycemic episode, right before she had to be rushed to the hospital. I'm getting the nurse, I said, starting toward the door again. Mrs. Henderson grabbed my arm firmly enough to leave marks that would last for days. If you walk out that door, you'll get detention for the rest of the semester. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could feel the entire class watching us, waiting to see what I would do. Laura was crying now, trying to shake Marcus awake gently. I looked down at Marcus again. His breathing was getting worse. His skin was getting clammy and pale. This wasn't some performance to get out of the test. This was serious. I don't care about detention, I said, shaking Henderson off. I ran. Her shouted threats followed me down the hallway, echoing off the lockers. Caroline Thompson, you get back here right now. You'll regret this. But I didn't stop. The corridor felt endless as I sprinted toward the nurse's office, my sneakers squeaking against the polished floor like a rubber duck chorus. My backpack bounced against my spine with each step. Mrs. Patterson, the school nurse, was eating a yogurt at her desk when I burst through her door. She took one look at my face, probably red and panicked, and immediately grabbed her emergency kit from the wall cabinet. Where? She asked, already moving toward the door with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with real emergencies before. Room 204. Kid collapsed, unconscious. His lips are turning pale. Diabetic? I think so. Maybe. I don't know, but something's really wrong. We ran back together, Mrs. Patterson's keys jangling like wind chimes as we rounded the corner. I could hear her radio crackling as she called ahead to the main office. By the time we reached the classroom, Mrs. Henderson had finally moved Marcus into the recovery position, but she was still acting like nothing serious had happened. The whole class was clustered around Marcus's desk, their faces pale with worry. Mrs. Patterson immediately knelt beside Marcus and began checking his vital signs with practiced hands. She pulled out her radio and called for an ambulance, her voice professional but urgent. This is Patterson in room 204. I need paramedics now. Student, unconscious, possible diabetic emergency, pulse is weak and rapid. She opened her emergency kit and pulled out a glucagon injection pen. Has he eaten today? She asked the class, not looking up from Marcus. He skipped lunch, Laura said through her tears. Said he wasn't hungry, and he didn't eat breakfast either. I saw him in first period, and he said he forgot. Mrs. Patterson frowned. How long has he been unconscious? At least 10 minutes, I said. Several other students nodded in agreement. She administered the injection quickly and efficiently. Marcus's breathing was still shallow, but at least his lips weren't getting any paler. The paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, though it felt like hours. They came through the door with a stretcher and medical bags, moving with a kind of calm urgency that only comes from years of experience. They immediately took over from Mrs. Patterson, checking Marcus's vital signs and blood glucose levels. One of them pulled out a small electronic device and pricked Marcus's finger. The reading on their meter made the lead paramedic shake his head seriously. 28, he said to his partner. How long did you say he's been unconscious? At least 10 minutes, I repeated. The paramedic's expression grew more concerned. That's quite low for this long. We need to move quickly. They started an IV line and began pushing glucose directly into Marcus's bloodstream. Within minutes, he started responding. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. What happened? He asked groggily, trying to sit up. Easy there, buddy, the paramedic said gently. You had a severe low blood sugar episode. We're taking you to the hospital to get you checked out. As they prepared to move him to the stretcher, Marcus looked around the room until his eyes found mine. Caroline, he said weakly. Thank you. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Just get better, okay? As they wheeled Marcus toward the door, Mrs. Henderson walked over to my desk like nothing had happened. She placed a pink detention slip on top of my notebook like she was serving me court papers. Tomorrow after school, room 204, don't be late. The whole class stared at her in disbelief. The paramedics were still in the hallway and she was handing out detention slips. Laura Martinez stood up from her desk, her face flushed with anger. Are you serious right now? She saved his life. Mrs. Henderson turned her cold stare on Laura. She violated a direct order and disrupted my classroom. Actions have consequences. But Marcus could have been in serious trouble, Tommy Williams said. That's enough, Henderson snapped. Everyone back to your seats. We still have 20 minutes of class left. She returned to the whiteboard like nothing had happened, stepping around the spot on the floor where Marcus had fallen. Now, where were we? The electron transport chain. But nobody was paying attention anymore. The entire class was staring at the area where Marcus had collapsed, where his health had been in jeopardy while our teacher worried about maintaining control. Jake Peterson raised his hand. Mrs. Henderson, shouldn't we talk about what just happened? There's nothing to talk about. Caroline chose to leave class without permission, and now she'll face the consequences. That's how the real world works. Emily Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief. The real world? In the real world, people help each other when someone's in trouble? Mrs. Henderson's face darkened. Emily, do you want to join Caroline in detention? The threat silenced the room, but I could see the anger in my classmates' faces. They knew what they'd witnessed, and they knew it wasn't right. When the bell finally rang, I was the first one out the door. I went straight to the principal's office, my hands still shaking from adrenaline and disbelief. The secretary looked up as I entered, probably noting my disheveled appearance and the urgency in my voice. Is Mr. Davis available? It's urgent. She buzzed him, and within minutes I was sitting across from Principal Davis's massive oak desk. His office smelled like coffee and old books, and there were framed diplomas covering one wall. He listened to my story, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained frustratingly neutral. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen scratching across the paper. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair, which creaked under his weight. I understand you were trying to help Caroline, but Mrs. Henderson is an experienced teacher with 15 years of service. She knows how to handle medical situations. I felt like I'd been slapped. She told me students fake emergencies to get out of tests. Marcus could have been in serious trouble. Mr. Davis shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting my eyes. The detention stands. You violated a direct order from your teacher. There have to be consequences, regardless of your intentions. So helping someone in a medical emergency is wrong if a teacher says not to do it? That's not what I'm saying, Caroline. But we can't have students walking out of class whenever they feel like it. What if every student decided they knew better than their teachers? I stared at him in disbelief. This wasn't about knowing better. This was about a medical emergency. According to Mrs. Henderson, the student was fine. She handled the situation appropriately. By doing nothing, by blocking me from getting help, but I could see I wasn't getting through to him. Mr. Davis had made up his mind before I even sat down. In his world, teacher authority trumped student safety. I walked out of his office feeling like I'd entered some alternate reality where helping someone in a medical emergency was a punishable offense. Hallways seemed to stretch forever as I made my way to my locker, other students giving me curious looks. Word was already spreading. I could hear whispered conversations stopping when I walked by, see students pointing at me and talking in hushed tones. That evening, I called Marcus's mom to check on him. Mrs. Chen answered on the first ring, her voice tired but grateful. Caroline, thank goodness you called. Marcus is stable, but they're keeping him overnight for observation. How bad was it? She was quiet for a moment. The doctor said his glucose was critically low. 28 is dangerous territory. If he'd been unconscious much longer, he could have gone into a coma. There could have been serious complications. My stomach dropped. Serious complications. While Mrs. Henderson was worried about students faking emergencies, the doctor said you probably saved his life by getting help when you did. If you'd waited even 5 more minutes. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew how close it had been. Thank you, Mrs. Chen said, her voice thick with emotion. You did the right thing, no matter what anyone at that school says. But at school the next day, I was the villain. Mrs. Henderson had spent her morning coffee break in the teacher's lounge, telling anyone who would listen about my disruptive behavior and complete disregard for authority. Word spread fast in a small school. Teachers who used to smile at me in the hallways now looked at me with disappointment. Some wouldn't even make eye contact. During lunch, I overheard Mr. Garcia talking to Mrs. Kim near the vending machines. Caroline Thompson walked out of Henderson's class yesterday. Complete disregard for authority. Henderson says it's part of a pattern. That's not like her, Mrs. Kim replied, glancing in my direction. She's usually such a good student. Well, you never really know kids these days. Henderson says she's been having problems all semester. Disrespectful, argumentative. I wanted to march over there and tell them the truth, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd already made up their minds. Mrs. Henderson's version was spreading like wildfire while the truth suffocated in silence. I ate my sandwich in the far corner of the cafeteria, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Even some of my friends seemed unsure about approaching me. The invisible scarlet letter was working perfectly. During chemistry class, Mr. Peterson gave me a concerned look when I walked in. After class, he pulled me aside. Caroline, is everything okay at home? Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been having some difficulties. I stared at him. What kind of difficulties? She didn't go into details, but she's concerned about your behavior lately. Said you've been acting out, being disrespectful. Mr. Peterson, I helped a student who collapsed. That's all I did. He looked uncomfortable. That's not how Mrs. Henderson tells it. And there it was. The poison was spreading, turning teachers against me with carefully crafted lies and half-truths. The detention was scheduled for 3:15. I showed up 5 minutes early and found Mrs. Henderson grading papers at her desk, red ink bleeding across student essays like wounds. She didn't look up when I entered. Take a seat in the back. You'll be copying pages 247 through 265 from the biology textbook, by hand, no abbreviations. For the next hour, I copied meaningless passages about photosynthesis while she worked at her desk. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the scratch of pencil on paper and the occasional satisfied grunt from Henderson as she marked another paper. Every few minutes, she'd look up at me with this satisfied smirk, like watching me write was the highlight of her day. Her eyes held a malicious glint that made my skin crawl. When the clock finally hit 4:15, she looked up from her grading. Finished? I held up the pages of copied text, my hand cramping from gripping the pencil so tightly. She glanced at them dismissively and handed me another detention slip. Same time tomorrow. Maybe you'll learn to follow instructions. This continued for a week. Every day at 3:15, another hour of mindless copying while Mrs. Henderson savored her power trip. Every day, another detention slip for the next afternoon. By Wednesday, she'd escalated the punishments. Instead of copying, I had to clean all the lab equipment. Beakers, test tubes, microscope slides. Everything had to be spotless, which meant scrubbing the same pieces multiple times until she was satisfied. Maybe some manual labor will teach you humility, she said, watching me scrub a beaker for the 3rd time. You clearly weren't raised to respect authority. My hands were raw from the harsh soap and constant scrubbing. When I finally finished, she inspected my work like a drill sergeant conducting inspection. Do it again. This one has water spots. By Thursday, other students started avoiding me in the hallways. The word was spreading that I was a problem student who couldn't be trusted. Teachers were giving me strange looks, and my grades started slipping in other classes because I couldn't get to after-school tutoring sessions. Mrs. Henderson had made sure the detentions ran until 5 p.m., eliminating any chance of getting extra help or participating in activities. Friday's detention was the worst yet. She made me reorganize the entire supply closet. Boxes of chemicals, lab equipment, outdated textbooks. Everything had to be sorted, labeled, and arranged to her exact specifications. This should keep you busy, she said with obvious satisfaction, and maybe next time you'll think twice before defying a teacher. I spent 3 hours in that stuffy closet, breathing in dust and chemical fumes while she sat at her desk reading a magazine. When I finally emerged, covered in grime and sneezing from the dust, she barely glanced up. Clean yourself up before you leave. We can't have you tracking dirt through the halls. My parents were starting to ask questions about why I was coming home so late every day. I kept making excuses about staying after for study groups, hoping this nightmare would end, but Mrs. Henderson showed no signs of letting up. By the time I got home that Friday, it was nearly 6 p.m. My parents were waiting in the kitchen, and they did not look happy. Sit down, Caroline, my dad said, his voice unusually stern. We need to talk. I knew I couldn't keep lying. The guilt was eating me alive, and I was exhausted from the week of abuse. So I told them everything. Marcus's collapse, Mrs. Henderson's refusal to get help, the detention, the escalating punishments. My dad's face went through about 6 different emotions before settling on pure fury. His jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break a tooth. My mom just sat there shaking her head in disbelief. You're telling me they're punishing you for getting help for an unconscious student? My dad asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That's exactly what I'm telling you. My mom pulled out her phone with the determination of a general planning battle strategy. We're calling the school first thing Monday morning, but Mrs. Henderson was already 3 steps ahead. Over the weekend, she'd spent hours crafting a formal complaint against me. On Monday morning, she filed it with the district office for chronic disruptive behavior and defiance of authority. The complaint was a masterpiece of manipulation, painting me as a troubled student with behavioral issues who'd been escalating all semester. She mentioned the DNA correction incident as evidence of my pattern of disrespect and my need to undermine teacher authority. I was called to the counselor's office during second period. Mrs. Foster, who'd always been kind to me, looked genuinely uncomfortable as she explained that the school board was reviewing my case. They're considering suspension, Caroline. This is serious. I felt like the world was tilting off its axis. For getting help when someone was having a medical emergency? Mrs. Foster sighed, rubbing her temples like she had a headache. Mrs. Henderson has been here for 15 years. She has an exemplary record. The administration trusts her judgment completely. What about Marcus? Ask him what happened. Marcus hasn't returned to school yet. And even if he had, Mrs. Henderson says you've been spreading stories to get sympathy and avoid consequences for your behavior. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. Every move I made just pulled me deeper into Henderson's web of lies. That afternoon, my parents met with Principal Davis and Vice Principal Martinez. I wasn't allowed in the room, but I could hear raised voices through the door. My dad's voice carried the most, punctuated by phrases like liability lawsuit and medical negligence. When they finally came out 45 minutes later, my dad looked like he wanted to put his fist through a wall. His face was red and his hands were balled into fists at his sides. They're standing by their teacher, he said through gritted teeth. But this isn't over. My mom had already started researching lawyers on her phone during the drive home. By Wednesday, we had an appointment with Patricia Wong, an education attorney who specialized in student rights cases. Mrs. Wong's office was in a sleek downtown building that smelled like expensive leather and fresh coffee. She listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When we finished, she asked to see all the documentation, the detention slips, the formal complaint, any emails or letters from the school. This is a clear case of retaliation, she said, reviewing the papers. But we'll need more evidence than just your word against hers. That's when I remembered something important. Our school had recently installed security cameras in all the hallways and classrooms as part of a safety upgrade after a break-in last spring. The whole incident with Marcus would be on video. Mrs. Wong's eyes lit up. That could be the smoking gun we need. I'll file a formal request for the footage immediately. The school initially refused, claiming technical difficulties with the recording system. Then they said the cameras in that particular classroom weren't working that day. When Mrs. Wong threatened legal action, they suddenly discovered that the recordings were available after all. While we waited for the footage, Mrs. Henderson escalated her campaign against me. She started calling my other teachers, planting seeds of doubt about my character and home life. I'm concerned about Caroline, she told Mr. Peterson after chemistry class. She's been having some behavioral issues. I think there might be problems at home. In chemistry class the next day, Mr. Peterson pulled me aside after the bell rang. Caroline Caroline, is everything okay? Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might be going through some family troubles. My family is fine. Mrs. Henderson is lying because I saved a student and she's embarrassed. Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. That's a serious accusation, Caroline. Mrs. Henderson is a respected colleague with years of experience. She's trying to destroy my reputation because I made her look bad in front of the class. But I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Mrs. Henderson's reputation was working against me like a shield, deflecting all accusations back at me. The whisper campaign spread to other teachers with surgical precision. In English, Mrs. Peterson started asking if I was getting the support I needed at home. In math, Mr. Williams suggested I might benefit from counseling services. Caroline, we're all concerned about you, Mrs. Peterson said after class one day. These stories about Mrs. Henderson, they just don't sound like the person we know. Because you don't really know her. You only see what she wants you to see. But I could tell I was losing her too. Mrs. Henderson's whisper campaign was working perfectly, isolating me from every potential ally. Meanwhile, my grades started slipping as the stress mounted. I couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't focus on homework. Every day felt like walking through a minefield, waiting for the next explosion. The video finally arrived on Thursday, and it was even more damning than we'd hoped. The camera angle captured everything. Marcus's collapse, my attempt to help, Mrs. Henderson physically blocking my exit, and me eventually pushing past her to get the nurse. But more importantly, there was audio. Crystal clear recording of Henderson threatening me with detention if I left, dismissing Marcus's medical emergency as fake, and telling the class that students fake emergencies to get out of tests. Mrs. Wong called us immediately after reviewing the footage. This is incredible evidence. No jury would side with the school after seeing this. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. When word somehow leaked that we had video evidence, she launched an even more vicious character assassination campaign. She started telling teachers that I had a history of emotional problems dating back to middle school. She suggested that my parents were going through a messy divorce and that I was acting out for attention. The rumors reached my other classes faster than wildfire in dry grass. Teachers who'd known me for years suddenly started treating me like a troubled child who needed careful handling. Caroline, I want you to know that my classroom is a safe space, Mrs. Peterson said during English class. If you need to talk about what's happening at home, I'm here. Nothing is happening at home. Mrs. Henderson is making things up, but the damage was already done. Even my closest friends started looking at me differently, wondering what they didn't know about my supposedly troubled family life. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of lies and manipulation. Every day brought new humiliation, new whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate on anything except the constant anxiety of wondering what Henderson would do next. Then something unexpected happened. Jessica Walsh, a quiet girl from my biology class, approached me at lunch during the second week of the campaign against me. I believe you, she said, sitting down across from me in the nearly empty cafeteria, about what happened with Marcus. I nearly cried with relief. You do? My older sister had Mrs. Henderson 3 years ago. She did the same thing to her, made up lies, got her in trouble with other teachers. My sister almost didn't graduate because of her. Jessica's sister Amy was now a sophomore at State University, but she agreed to meet with us and tell her story to our lawyer. Amy drove down that weekend, still visibly angry about her experience with Henderson. Amy Walsh sat in Mrs. Wong's office and described a pattern of behavior that was chillingly familiar. Mrs. Henderson had targeted her after Amy questioned a grade on a test she was certain she'd answered correctly. She made my senior year absolute misery, Amy said, her hands clenched into fists. She told my other teachers I was cheating, that I had behavioral problems at home, that I was emotionally unstable. She even called 2 of the colleges I'd applied to and suggested they reconsider my applications. Mrs. Wong took careful notes, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Did anyone believe you when you tried to tell them what was happening? Amy shook her head bitterly. She's very convincing. And she'd been there so long, everyone just accepted her word as gospel. My parents tried to fight it, but the administration closed ranks around her. How did it end? I asked. I barely graduated, lost 2 scholarship opportunities because of her lies. It took me 2 extra years to get into college because she'd poisoned so many wells. Amy's voice was tight with old anger. But I survived, and now she's doing it to you. Mrs. Wong tapped her pen against her legal pad. This establishes a clear pattern of retaliation, but we'll need more recent examples to make the strongest case possible. That's when Jessica spoke up. There might be others. In our class, everyone's too scared to speak up because they've seen what she does to people who cross her. But maybe if they knew, they weren't alone. We started reaching out carefully, Jessica talking to current students while Amy contacted people from her graduating class. What we found was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Mrs. Henderson had a clear, methodical pattern. She'd pick 1 or 2 students each year who challenged her authority in any way, questioning a grade, correcting a mistake, even just asking too many questions. Then she'd systematically destroy their reputations through a carefully orchestrated campaign of lies and manipulation. Most students had just endured it and moved on, too afraid or too broken to fight back. But some had lasting damage that followed them for years. Kevin Martinez from Amy's class had lost a full scholarship to Northwestern because Henderson convinced his guidance counselor that he was emotionally unstable and potentially disruptive. Maria Santos had been pushed out of all AP classes after Henderson told the other teachers that she was cheating and couldn't handle the academic pressure. Maria ended up at community college instead of the 4-year university she dreamed of attending. By Friday, we had sworn statements from 6 former students spanning 3 years. The pattern was undeniable, and Mrs. Wong was building a case that went far beyond my individual situation. This isn't just about Caroline anymore, she told my parents. This is about a teacher who's been abusing her position to destroy students' futures for years. Then Marcus returned to school. It was a Thursday morning in early November, and I was at my locker grabbing books for first period when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around to see Marcus standing there looking completely healthy and back to his normal self. His face lit up when he saw me. Caroline, I was hoping to see you. Marcus, how are you feeling? Much better, thanks to you. His expression grew serious. I heard what's been happening, what Mrs. Henderson has been doing to you. It's not right. I felt tears prick at my eyes. After weeks of isolation and character assassination, having someone acknowledge the truth felt like finding water in a desert. She's telling everyone that I made the whole thing up to get attention. Marcus shook his head firmly. I remember everything that happened before I collapsed. I remember asking for help and her refusing. I remember her saying students fake emergencies to get out of tests. I remember her trying to stop you from leaving. His testimony would be crucial, but more than that, just having him believe me restored something that Henderson's campaign had been trying to destroy, my faith in the truth. That afternoon, Marcus and his parents met with Mrs. Wong. His account corroborated everything I'd said, but more importantly, his medical records showed just how serious his condition had been. The doctor said another 5 to 10 minutes without treatment could have led to serious complications, Mrs. Chen Chen explained, her voice still shaky with the memory. Caroline literally saved our son, and they're punishing her for it. Dr. Chen, who is a physician himself, provided additional medical testimony about the seriousness of Marcus's condition. A glucose level of 28 with loss of consciousness is a medical emergency. Every minute of delay increases the risk of serious complications. Mrs. Wong now had multiple pieces of evidence: the security footage, Marcus's testimony, medical documentation proving the severity of his condition, and a documented pattern of retaliation spanning multiple years. She scheduled a meeting with the superintendent for the following Monday. But the night before the meeting, Mrs. Henderson made the biggest mistake of her career. She called my house at 9:30 p.m., thinking she was calling Mrs. Thompson, another teacher who lived in our neighborhood and had a similar last name in the school directory. My mom answered the phone in the kitchen while I was doing homework at the dining room table. "Hello? Thank God you picked up," came Mrs. Henderson's voice, loud enough for me to hear from the next room. "I need to talk to someone about this Caroline Thompson situation." My mom's eyes widened, and she quickly put the phone on speaker, while gesturing for me to grab the recording app on her phone. Mrs. Henderson launched into a vicious rant that revealed everything we'd suspected and more. "This little troublemaker thinks she can embarrass me in front of my class and get away with it. I'm going to make sure she's expelled from this school and blacklisted from every decent college in the state." She kept going, digging herself deeper with every word. "I've already called 3 colleges on her application list, told them she has serious behavioral problems and a history of defying authority. No decent school will want to deal with that kind of trouble." My mom let her talk, recording every word while making faces of shock and disgust. Henderson's voice dripped with malice as she outlined her plans. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know exactly how to handle problem students like her. By the time I'm done, her academic record will be so damaged that she'll be lucky to get into community college." She bragged about her systematic campaign against me, admitting to spreading lies to other teachers and sabotaging my relationships with potential allies. The best part is, everyone believes me because I've been here so long. Her word against mine? Please, I'm a respected educator with an exemplary record. Finally, after 3 full minutes of incriminating herself, my mom spoke up. "This is Caroline's mother, not whoever you think you're calling." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then the line went dead with a sharp click, but the damage was done. Mrs. Henderson had just confessed to everything we'd suspected and more, all while being recorded on a clear phone line. My mom immediately called Mrs. Wong, who nearly shouted with excitement when she heard about the recording. "This is incredible. She just admitted to harassment, educational sabotage, and defamation of character. The school district will have no choice but to act." The superintendent's meeting the next day was unlike anything I'd expected. Mrs. Wong played the recording for everyone in the room: Superintendent Johnson, Principal Davis, Vice Principal Martinez, and the head of the school board. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Henderson's voice filled the air with her venomous threats. Superintendent Johnson's face went from professional concern to barely controlled anger as the recording continued. "This is completely unacceptable," he said when the recording ended. "We'll launch a formal investigation immediately, and Mrs. Henderson will be suspended pending the outcome." Within 2 hours, Mrs. Henderson was escorted from the building by security, carrying a box of her personal belongings. I watched from the window of Mrs. Foster's office as she loaded her car, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. The news spread through the school like wildfire. Students who had been whispering about me behind my back suddenly wanted to know what had really happened. Teachers who had treated me with suspicion started looking embarrassed about their behavior. But even suspended, Mrs. Henderson wasn't going quietly. She hired Lawrence Blackwell, a lawyer known for defending teachers in disciplinary cases, and prepared to fight the charges. Her defense strategy was predictably desperate. Blackwell claimed the recording was taken out of context and that Mrs. Henderson was simply venting about a difficult student to a colleague. He suggested that I had somehow orchestrated Marcus's medical emergency to create drama and get attention. "My client is a dedicated educator with 15 years of exemplary service," Blackwell said during a preliminary hearing. "She's being railroaded by a troubled student and her litigious parents." It was so ridiculous that even Mrs. Henderson seemed embarrassed by some of the arguments. But Blackwell pressed on, trying to paint me as a manipulative troublemaker who'd fooled everyone, including the paramedics and doctors. The formal hearing took place 3 weeks later in the district office boardroom. Mrs. Wong had prepared our case meticulously, organizing all the evidence into a compelling narrative that was impossible to ignore. The security footage was played first, showing Marcus's collapse and Mrs. Henderson's callous response. The audio was crystal clear, capturing her dismissive comments about fake emergencies and her physical attempts to prevent me from getting help. Then came Marcus's testimony. He spoke clearly and calmly about what he remembered from that day, how sick he'd felt, and how Mrs. Henderson had refused to let him get help, even when he'd asked directly. "I remember feeling dizzy and asking for permission to go to the nurse," he said. "Mrs. Henderson told me to put my hand down and accused me of trying to get out of a test. The next thing I remember is waking up in the ambulance." Dr. Chen provided medical testimony about the seriousness of Marcus's condition and the potential consequences of delayed treatment. "Another 5 minutes could have resulted in serious complications," he said firmly. Caroline's quick action prevented a medical crisis from becoming a tragedy. The other students who'd been victimized by Mrs. Henderson told their stories next. Amy Walsh spoke about the scholarship she'd lost, Kevin Martinez about the colleges that had rejected him after Henderson's calls, Maria Santos about being pushed out of AP classes. Each testimony painted the same picture: a teacher who used her authority to destroy students who dared to challenge her, no matter how legitimate their concerns. Finally, Mrs. Wong played the recorded phone call. The room was dead silent as Henderson's voice filled the air with threats and admissions of sabotage. Several board members shook their heads in disgust. One board member, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Marcus, asked, "Mrs. Henderson, do you deny making these statements?" Henderson's lawyer whispered something in her ear before she answered. I was frustrated and spoke inappropriately, but my actions in the classroom were appropriate. "Appropriate?" Mrs. Chen shot back. "You prevented a student from getting medical help for a classmate having a diabetic emergency. How is that appropriate?" Blackwell's defense was weak and desperate. He tried to argue that Mrs. Henderson was just a dedicated teacher trying to maintain classroom discipline, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Even if we accept that Mrs. Henderson believed the medical emergency was fake," Mrs. Wong said in her closing argument, "the recording proves that her actions were motivated by personal revenge, not educational judgment." The school board deliberated for only 30 minutes. When they returned, Superintendent Johnson looked grim. After reviewing all the evidence, the board votes unanimously to terminate Mrs. Henderson's employment, effective effective immediately. Her teaching license will also be revoked pending a state investigation. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled as the verdict was read. 15 years of her career ended in disgrace because she couldn't let go of her ego long enough to get help for a student having a medical emergency. Blackwell immediately announced they would appeal the decision, but Mrs. Wong was confident. No appeals court will overturn this. The evidence is too clear. The local news picked up the story that evening. Teacher fired after punishing student for saving classmate. Ran on all 3 network affiliates. Mrs. Henderson's photo appeared next to headlines about administrative overreach and student safety. By the next morning, the story had gone viral on social media. Parents across the district were sharing the article with comments like, "This could have been my child," and "How many other teachers are like this?" The story even made national news when a cable network picked it up. Suddenly, I was getting interview requests from reporters wanting to talk about student rights and teacher accountability. Mrs. Henderson tried to get another teaching job, but the story followed her everywhere. School districts wouldn't even interview her once they searched her name online. Within 6 months, she had moved to another state, but even there, the story haunted her. Meanwhile, the positive changes at our school were immediate and far-reaching. The administration implemented new policies about medical emergencies. No teacher could prevent a student from seeking help for a medical situation, period. They also added mandatory training on recognizing genuine emergencies versus attention-seeking behavior, though most teachers admitted they would have acted differently than Henderson regardless. Students who had been quietly suffering under other problem teachers started speaking up, emboldened by seeing that the administration could no longer ignore patterns of abuse. Mrs. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, was investigated after 3 students came forward with similar stories about retaliation and grade manipulation. She resigned before the investigation concluded. Mr. Thompson in the math department was put on probation after students reported his habit of humiliating kids who asked for help. The entire school culture shifted. Teachers became more careful about how they treated students, knowing that their actions would face real scrutiny. Students felt safer reporting problems, knowing they wouldn't automatically be dismissed. Mr. Davis, who had initially dismissed my concerns, personally apologized during a meeting in his office. "I should have investigated your claims instead of automatically siding with a teacher just because of her tenure. I failed you, and I'm sorry. My other teachers started treating me differently too." Mr. Peterson in chemistry pulled me aside after class one day. "Caroline, I owe you an apology. I let Mrs. Henderson's lies influence my judgment instead of trusting what I knew about your character." Marcus and I became incredibly close friends after everything we'd been through together. We started a peer advocacy group at school for students who needed help navigating conflicts with teachers. "You saved me," he told me one afternoon as we worked on biology homework in the library. "And then you saved me again by fighting Henderson when she tried to cover it up." The peer advocacy group grew quickly. Within a semester, we had 25 student members and 3 teacher advisors. We helped students document problems with teachers, navigate the complaint process, and provided emotional support during investigations. We helped 7 students that first year, including a freshman who was being targeted by her geometry teacher for asking too many questions, and a senior who was being graded unfairly because she'd reported a coach for inappropriate comments. My parents sued the school district for emotional distress, defamation, and educational interference. The case took 8 months to resolve, but we eventually settled for $150,000, enough to pay for my entire college education. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for better oversight of teacher conduct, clearer policies protecting students who report emergencies, and annual training on recognizing and preventing teacher retaliation. The colleges that Mrs. Henderson had contacted to sabotage my applications all sent letters of apology. Harvard, Stanford, and MIT not only restored my applications to their original status, but offered additional consideration for overcoming adversity. I chose MIT for their biomedical engineering program, inspired by my own experience to pursue emergency medicine with a focus on developing better emergency response systems in schools. My senior year was completely different from the nightmare junior year had become. Teachers treated me with respect, even admiration. I was elected class president, nominated for multiple academic awards, and asked to speak at graduation about courage and standing up for what's right. Marcus was valedictorian, maintaining his perfect GPA despite everything he'd been through. In his speech, he talked about the importance of having advocates, people willing to fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. "Caroline Thompson saved me in that biology classroom," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. "But she did more than that. She showed all of us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when the whole system is against you." Years later, I became Dr. Caroline Thompson, attending physician and patient advocate. I developed training programs for schools on emergency response protocols, working with districts nationwide to prevent the kind of institutional failure that had nearly cost Marcus his health. Marcus became a successful biomedical engineer whose glucose monitoring innovations have helped thousands of diabetic patients avoid emergencies like the one he experienced. We often presented together at education conferences, telling our story to administrators and teachers who were still learning how to balance authority with responsibility. I often get letters from teachers who attended our training sessions, telling me about students they helped because they remembered our story. Mrs. Henderson tried to destroy me, but instead she created an advocate who would spend her career preventing other students from facing what we endured. Last month, Marcus started his freshman year at MIT studying biomedical engineering. He texted me a photo from his first day with the message, "Thanks for saving me." Again, every morning when I put on my white coat and walk into the emergency department, I think about that scared 17-year-old girl who made a split-second decision to run for help. She had no idea that moment would define the rest of her life, but she knew what was right. Mrs. Henderson wanted to make me an example of what happens to students who step out of line. Instead, she made me an example of what happens when you refuse to let injustice win. Mrs. Henderson lost her job, her reputation, and her career. But Marcus and I, we found our calling, and that makes us the real winners in this story.